That quote. I walked through the glass doors of Meridian Industries that Tuesday morning, my worn medical bag slung over my shoulder, never imagining that a simple contract job would shatter everything I thought I knew about family, sacrifice, and the power of human connection. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The marble lobby stretched before me like a cathedral of corporate success, all gleaming surfaces and expensive silence. The kind of place where my military boots felt out of place despite being polished to regulation shine. The receptionist barely glanced up as she directed me toward the executive elevator, her manicured fingers dancing across a keyboard that probably cost more than my monthly rent. I was here because Meridian's CEO had a son who needed specialized care, something about communication difficulties and mobility issues that their usual medical staff couldn't handle. The pay was good enough to keep me from asking too many questions, though I should have known that jobs paying 3 times the normal rate always came with complications. When the elevator opened on the 32nd floor, I found myself face to face with David Chen, a man whose photograph had graced the covers of business magazines for his innovative work in renewable energy technology. He was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of controlled intensity that came from building an empire before most people figured out their career path. His handshake was firm but distracted, his attention clearly divided between our meeting and whatever crisis was consuming his thoughts. Joseph Martinez, I introduced myself, keeping my voice professional despite the lingering question of why a billionaire needed a former army medic when he could afford the best specialists in the country. I understand you have a situation that requires someone with my particular background. David's expression shifted then, revealing something vulnerable beneath the executive mask, a father's desperation that no amount of money could solve. "My son, Alexander," he said quietly, leading me down a hallway lined with abstract paintings that probably cost more than most people's houses. "He was in an accident 8 months ago. The doctors say his physical recovery is progressing, but there's something else, something they can't explain." We stopped outside a door marked with a small nameplate reading A. Chen in elegant script. Through the crack beneath the door, I could hear a voice speaking in rapid, fluent Arabic, the words flowing with an urgency that suggested someone trying desperately to communicate something important. David's face tightened with the familiar pain of a parent watching their child suffer in a language they couldn't understand. "He won't speak English anymore," David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not a single word since the accident. The neurologists say there's no medical reason for it, no brain damage, that would explain this selective mutism. But he talks constantly in Arabic, sometimes for hours like he's trying to tell us something crucial and we're too stupid to understand." The moment I stepped into Alexander's room, everything changed. The 16-year-old boy sitting in the specialized wheelchair looked nothing like his father, his features softer and more angular, suggesting a mixed heritage that David hadn't mentioned. But it wasn't his appearance that stopped me cold in the doorway. It was the Arabic words pouring from his lips, spoken with an accent and fluency that belonged to someone who had lived and breathed the language from birth, not learned it in some expensive private school. "Ana arif laka papa, ana arif mahadath haqiqatan." The words came out in a desperate rush, his dark eyes fixed on his father with an intensity that made my chest tighten. I knew enough Arabic from my deployments to catch fragments. "I know you, father. I know what really happened." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. David stepped forward with the careful movements of someone approaching a wounded animal, his hands outstretched in a gesture of helpless love. "Alexander, please," he said in English, his voice breaking slightly. "Just try to tell me what you need. Anything you need, son. Just please speak to me in words I can understand." But Alexander's response was another torrent of Arabic, faster and more urgent than before, his paralyzed legs shifting restlessly in the wheelchair as his upper body strained toward his father. "Laysa hada bayti. Hada laysa hayati. Uridu an arji'a ila Mama Fatima." This isn't my home. This isn't my life. I want to go back to Mama Fatima. The words hit me like a physical blow, not because of their meaning, but because of what they revealed about this family's carefully constructed reality. I'd heard similar phrases from children in refugee camps, kids who had been separated from their families and placed in unfamiliar environments where nothing made sense anymore. But this was supposed to be a wealthy American teenager recovering from an accident in his father's mansion, not a displaced child crying for a mother named Fatima. David noticed my reaction immediately, his corporate instinct still sharp enough to read the shift in my expression. "You understand what he's saying," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Please, Joseph." The other specialists, the therapists, the psychiatrists, none of them speak Arabic fluently enough to really communicate with him. I've hired translators, but he won't talk to them either. You're the first person who seems to actually comprehend what he's trying to tell us. I knelt beside Alexander's wheelchair, meeting his eyes at his level, and spoke in the careful Arabic I'd learned during 3 tours in the Middle East. "Ahlan, Alexander. Is me Joseph. Uridu an usaidak." "Hello, Alexander. My name is Joseph. I want to help you." The effect was immediate and devastating. Alexander's face crumpled with relief so profound that tears started streaming down his cheeks, and he reached out with trembling hands to grab my wrist. "أنت تتفهم. أنت تتفهم العربية. رجاءً ساعدني في العودة إلى بيتي الحقيقي." You understand. You understand Arabic. Please help me return to my real home. The drive back to my apartment that evening felt longer than usual. Alexander's desperate words echoing in my mind, like fragments of a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. David had hired me for what he called communication therapy. But there was something fundamentally wrong with the entire situation that went far beyond language barriers or trauma-induced selective mutism. I'd worked with enough displaced children during my military service to recognize the signs of someone who had been torn from their cultural roots, and everything about Alexander's behavior suggested a kid who genuinely believed he was living in the wrong life. My one-bedroom apartment in Central Phoenix was a stark contrast to the luxury I'd witnessed at Meridian Industries, but it was home in a way that David's mansion clearly wasn't for his son. I spread the medical files David had given me across my kitchen table, studying the timeline of Alexander's accident and subsequent recovery. According to the reports, the boy had been struck by a drunk driver while walking home from his private school 8 months ago. The physical injuries were severe but not life-threatening. Spinal compression that had left him partially paralyzed from the waist down, some internal injuries that had healed completely, and a minor concussion that should have resolved within weeks. What bothered me was the complete absence of any mention of Arabic language skills in his pre-accident medical history. The file described Alexander as an honor student at Phoenix Preparatory Academy, fluent in Mandarin and Spanish due to his mixed Chinese-American heritage. But there was no indication that he had ever studied Arabic or shown any interest in Middle Eastern culture. Yet, the boy I'd met that afternoon spoke Arabic with the natural fluency of someone who had been immersed in the language from early childhood, complete with colloquial expressions and emotional inflections that couldn't be learned from textbooks. I pulled out my laptop and began researching everything I could find about David Chen and his family history. The public information was extensive but oddly sanitized, the kind of carefully curated biography that successful executives use to control their public image. David had built Meridian Industries from nothing after immigrating from Taiwan in his early 20s, transforming a small electronics repair shop into a renewable energy empire worth over $2 billion. He was described as a devoted single father who had raised Alexander alone after his wife's death in childbirth, a tragic but inspiring story of determination and paternal love. But as I dug deeper into archived news articles and business profiles, inconsistencies began to emerge. The earliest mentions of David's family life were vague about details referring to his adopted son, before later articles switched to describing Alexander as his biological child. There were gaps in the timeline that didn't quite make sense, periods where David had traveled extensively to the Middle East for business development that seemed unrelated to his company's focus on domestic renewable energy projects. I spent hours cross-referencing dates and locations, my military training and intelligence analysis proving unexpectedly useful for investigating a businessman's past. David had made at least 6 extended trips to Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria between 2008 and 2010, always traveling alone according to immigration records I managed to access through contacts from my service days. These trips coincided perfectly with a period when his business was supposedly struggling financially, making expensive international travel seem like an unlikely priority for a man trying to save his company. The most troubling discovery came when I found a small news item from a Jordanian newspaper, dated September 2010, about an orphanage fire in Amman that had displaced dozens of children. The article was brief and in Arabic, but it mentioned international adoption agencies working to place the displaced children with families in Europe and North America. The timing aligned perfectly with David's final trip to the region and with the first public mention of his son in American business publications. I translated the Arabic article line by line, my hands growing steadier as the implications became clear. The orphanage had been home to children whose parents had been killed in the ongoing regional conflicts, kids who spoke Arabic as their first language and had limited exposure to English or other Western languages. If Alexander had been one of these children, it would explain everything: his fluent Arabic, his desperate pleas to return to Mama Fatima, who might have been a caregiver at the orphanage, and his fundamental sense of displacement in David's luxurious but culturally alien world. My phone rang at 11:30 that night, David's name appearing on the caller ID with the kind of urgency that suggested a crisis. His voice was strained when I answered, background noise indicating he was calling from a hospital or medical facility. "Joseph, I need you to come back. Now. Alexander's condition has deteriorated significantly since you left. He's been asking for you specifically, using your name in Arabic, but he won't communicate with anyone else. The doctors think he might be having some kind of psychological breakdown." I was already reaching for my keys before he finished speaking, the protective instincts I'd developed as a combat medic overriding any questions about professional boundaries or appropriate working hours. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't let them sedate him until I arrive." If he's trying to communicate something important, we need to understand what it is before we suppress his ability to speak. The drive to David's Scottsdale mansion took me through neighborhoods where houses were measured in acres rather than square feet, each property a monument to the kind of wealth that could reshape reality according to personal preference. But all the money in the world couldn't change the fundamental truth that I was beginning to understand. Alexander wasn't David's biological son, and somewhere deep in his traumatized psyche, he remembered a life that had been systematically erased and replaced with a fiction designed to serve his adoptive father's needs rather than his own. When I arrived at the house, David met me at the front door with the frantic energy of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his expensive shirt wrinkled, and his hair unkempt from running his hands through it repeatedly. "He's been calling for someone named Fatima for the past 3 hours, David said as he led me through hallways lined with family photographs that suddenly looked like elaborate props rather than genuine memories. "The name means something to him, but I have no idea who she is or why he thinks she's important. I've never heard him mention anyone by that name before the accident." Alexander's bedroom was a shrine to expensive attempts to create happiness through material possessions. Every piece of furniture was custom-made and perfectly suited to his mobility needs. The technology was state-of-the-art, and the entertainment options were endless. But none of it could disguise the fundamental wrongness of the space, the complete absence of anything that reflected his actual cultural identity or personal history. The boy himself was sitting upright in his specialized bed, his eyes bright with fever or emotional exhaustion, speaking in rapid Arabic to someone only he could see. When he noticed me entering the room, his expression shifted to desperate relief, and he extended his arms toward me with the trust of a child who had finally found someone who understood his language and his pain. "Joseph Habibi ساعدني في الكلام مع بابا دافيد. يجب أن يعرف الحقيقة حول من أنا حقيقة. أنا لست ابنه الحقيقي، وأنا أتذكر كل شيء." "Joseph, my dear, help me speak with Papa David. He must know the truth about who I really am. I am not his real son, and I remember everything." The words hung in the air like an accusation and a plea combined, and I watched David's face go pale as he processed what his son had just revealed. Even without understanding Arabic, the businessman's instincts were sharp enough to recognize that Alexander had just shattered the foundation of their entire relationship. The silence that followed Alexander's revelation stretched between us like a chasm that no amount of money or medical intervention could bridge. David stood frozen in the doorway, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, denial, and something that looked dangerously close to panic. I realized that this moment represented the collision of two incompatible realities: the carefully constructed narrative that David had built around his family, and the traumatic memories that Alexander's accident had somehow unlocked. I knelt beside Alexander's bed and spoke to him gently in Arabic, trying to keep my voice calm despite the magnitude of what he was revealing. "Alexander, أنا مهم أن تحدثني بهدوء. ما تذكر من حياتك قبل أن تأتي إلى هنا." "Alexander, it's important that you speak to me calmly. What do you remember from your life before you came here? Alexander's eyes filled with tears, but his voice became steadier as he began to speak, as if finally having someone who understood his language had given him the strength to share his burden. كان اسمي خليل وكنت أعيش في دار الأيتام في أمان. ماما فاطمة كانت تهتم بنا جميعا وقالت لي أن أحب لغتنا وثقافتنا. ثم جاء رجل كثير المال وقال لي سيكون لي أبجدد في بلد بعيد. My blood ran cold as I translated his words in my mind. His name had been Khalil, and he had lived in an orphanage in Amman. Mama Fatima had taken care of all of them, and had told him to love their language and culture. Then a wealthy man had come and said he would have a new father in a distant country. David had been watching our exchange with growing agitation, and finally interrupted with the desperate authority of someone accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment. What is he saying, Joseph? I need to know what's going on here. This is my son, Alexander Chen, and he's clearly suffering from some kind of trauma-induced delusion. Whatever he thinks he remembers, it can't be real. I stood slowly and faced David, my military training helping me remain calm in the face of what was clearly going to be a confrontational conversation. David, I think we need to have a very serious discussion about Alexander's background. The things he's telling me aren't consistent with the medical history you provided, and they're too detailed and culturally specific to be random delusions. David's corporate instincts kicked in immediately, his posture shifting to the defensive stance of a businessman protecting sensitive information. I don't know what you're implying, but Alexander has been my son since birth. I have legal documents, birth certificates, medical records going back to infancy. Whatever confusion this accident has caused, we need to focus on his recovery, not chase conspiracy theories. But Alexander had been following our English conversation with the sharp intelligence of someone who understood far more than he was letting on, and he suddenly spoke directly to his adoptive father in heavily accented but clear English. Papa David, I remember now. I remember everything about before. You took me from Mama Fatima when the building burned down. You said I would be safe, but you made me forget who I was. The admission hung in the air like a lit fuse, and I watched David's carefully controlled facade begin to crack. His hands were shaking slightly as he moved to the window, staring out at the manicured grounds of his estate as if the perfect landscaping could somehow restore order to the chaos that was engulfing his personal life. The adoption was completely legal, David said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The orphanage had been destroyed. The children needed homes, and I could provide opportunities that would have been impossible in Jordan. I gave him the best education, the best medical care, a life of privilege and security that most people can only dream about. Alexander's response was immediate and fierce, his English becoming stronger as his emotions intensified. But you never asked what I wanted. You changed my name, you told me my parents were dead. You made me forget my real language and my real culture. You built me a prison made of expensive things and called it love. I found myself in the impossible position of mediating between a father who genuinely believed he had saved a child and a son who felt his entire identity had been stolen. My experience with trauma victims had taught me that both perspectives could be simultaneously true, that rescue and violation could be two sides of the same well-intentioned action. David, I said carefully, I think you need to understand that regardless of your intentions, Alexander has experienced what we call cultural trauma. When children are removed from their linguistic and cultural environment, even for good reasons, they can suffer psychological damage that doesn't become apparent until years later. David turned from the window with the aggressive energy of someone who was used to solving problems through force of will and financial resources. So what are you suggesting? That I was wrong to give him a better life? That I should have left him in a war zone to grow up in poverty and instability? I saved him, Joseph. Everything I did was to protect him and give him opportunities. Papa David, Alexander interrupted, his voice carrying a maturity that seemed far beyond his 16 years. You saved my body, but you killed my soul. Every day for 6 years I felt like something was missing, like I was living someone else's life. The accident didn't damage my brain, it broke down the walls you built in my mind to keep me from remembering who I really am. The confrontation was escalating beyond anything I was trained to handle, but I recognized that this moment represented a critical turning point for both of them. David's empire had been built on his ability to control outcomes through strategic thinking and resource deployment. But he was facing a problem that couldn't be solved with money or corporate maneuvering. Alexander needed acknowledgement of his pain and validation of his cultural identity. not more expensive attempts to buy his happiness. I made a decision that would later prove to be either the biggest mistake or the most important intervention of my career. David, I think you need to consider the possibility that helping Alexander heal is going to require more than medical treatment. He needs to reconnect with his cultural roots, and he needs to process the trauma of losing his original identity. David's response was immediate and defensive. Absolutely not. I won't allow him to be filled with romanticized notions about a life that would have offered him nothing but hardship and limitation. He's an American citizen now, with opportunities and privileges that most people would sacrifice anything to obtain. But Alexander had been listening to our conversation with the focused attention of someone whose entire future was being decided by adults who might or might not understand his needs. I don't want your opportunities if they mean I have to pretend to be someone I'm not, he said, his voice carrying a determination that reminded me of combat veterans who had decided they would rather die than compromise their core values. The standoff that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like the moment when years of carefully maintained balance finally tips into chaos. David was facing the possibility that his son might reject everything he had worked to provide, and Alexander was demanding recognition of an identity that his father viewed as a threat to everything they had built together. That's when Alexander made the announcement that would change the trajectory of all our lives. "Papa David, I want to contact Mama Fatima. I want to know if she's still alive, and I want her to know that I remember her and that I never forgot the songs she taught me in Arabic." David's face went white, with something beyond panic, and I realized that this conversation had just moved beyond family therapy into territory that could have legal, financial, and international implications that none of us were prepared to handle. The weeks that followed Alexander's demand to contact Mama Fatima transformed David's pristine corporate headquarters into something resembling a war room, complete with lawyers, private investigators, and international consultants who specialized in adoption disputes and cross-border family reunification cases. I watched from my unique position as both medical consultant and the only person who could effectively communicate with Alexander as two powerful forces collided: a teenager's desperate need to reclaim his cultural identity and a billionaire's equally desperate need to protect the family structure he had spent years constructing. David's initial response had been predictably strategic, mobilizing every resource at his disposal to contain what he clearly viewed as a threat to his parental authority and his company's reputation. Within 48 hours of Alexander's revelation, Meridian Industries' legal team had compiled a comprehensive file documenting the legitimacy of the adoption process, complete with official paperwork from Jordanian authorities, medical records, and witness statements from orphanage officials who had facilitated the placement. But Alexander proved to be far more resilient and determined than his adoptive father had anticipated. The accident that had paralyzed his legs had somehow unlocked memories and linguistic abilities that had been dormant for years, and he used his newfound clarity with the tactical precision of someone who had inherited David's strategic intelligence while maintaining his own moral compass. I found myself serving as translator and mediator in conversations that grew increasingly complex as both father and son revealed layers of their relationship that had been carefully hidden beneath the surface of their public personas. Alexander's English improved dramatically when he was discussing emotionally charged topics, as if anger and determination were helping him break through linguistic barriers that had seemed insurmountable just weeks earlier. "Papa David," Alexander said during one particularly intense session in his bedroom, his voice carrying the controlled fury of someone who had been systematically lied to for years. "I want you to understand something very clearly. I am grateful that you saved my life and gave me opportunities. But gratitude does not mean I have to surrender my soul to make you comfortable with your decisions." David's response revealed the depth of his own internal conflict, the struggle between his genuine love for Alexander and his terror of losing control over their relationship. "Son, you don't understand the dangers of the world you're romanticizing. The orphanage where you lived was destroyed by violence. The region is still unstable. Mama Fatima, if she's even still alive, is probably struggling with poverty and uncertainty that would break your heart." But Alexander had been researching his past with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had inherited his adoptive father's business instincts. Using the computer access that David had provided for his education, he had been corresponding with international humanitarian organizations, refugee assistance groups, and former orphanage workers who might have information about the woman who had cared for him during his early childhood. The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon when Alexander received an email response from a refugee resettlement coordinator in Amman who had worked with displaced children during the period when the orphanage fire had occurred. The message was brief but devastating in its implications. Fatima al-Rashid was not only alive but had been searching for information about the children who had been placed for international adoption following the fire. I was present when Alexander opened the email, serving as translator and emotional support as he read the Arabic text that confirmed his memories and validated his cultural identity in ways that no amount of expensive therapy could have accomplished. The message included a recent photograph of Mama Fatima, now in her 60s but still recognizable as the woman whose face had haunted Alexander's dreams and subconscious artwork for years. Habibi Khalil, the message began, using the Arabic name that Alexander had been forbidden to speak for 6 years. كل يوم كنت أفكر فيك وأتمنى أن تكون آمن وسعيد في حياتك الجادة. My dear Khalil, every day I have thought of you and hoped that you are safe and happy in your new life. The emotional impact of receiving this message was immediate and overwhelming. Alexander broke down in tears that seemed to come from years of suppressed grief and cultural displacement, crying not just for the reunion with his surrogate mother but for the validation that his memories were real and that his sense of loss had been justified all along. David's reaction to the discovery of Mama Fatima's survival was complex and troubling. His initial response was relief that the woman who had cared for Alexander was alive and well, but this was quickly overshadowed by panic about the implications of direct contact between his son and someone who represented his pre-adoption identity. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," David said to me during a private conversation in his corporate office, his usual composure cracking under the pressure of circumstances that were spiraling beyond his control. Once Alexander starts communicating with people from his past, he's going to be filled with guilt and confusion about his current life. They'll make him feel like he betrayed his cultural heritage by accepting the opportunities I've provided. I tried to help David understand that his fears were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of trauma, recovery, and cultural identity formation. David, Alexander isn't going to reject you because he reconnects with his roots. But he needs to integrate all parts of his identity to become a psychologically healthy adult. Right now, he feels like he's living a lie, and that's causing more damage than any external influence could. But David's corporate instincts were driving him toward a solution that would maintain his control while appearing to address Alexander's needs. He proposed a carefully managed reunion with Mama Fatima that would take place under controlled circumstances, possibly bringing her to Phoenix for a supervised visit that would satisfy Alexander's emotional requirements while ensuring that she couldn't, quote, poison him against the life we've built together. Alexander's response to this proposal was swift and uncompromising. "No," he said in English that was becoming more confident and articulate every day. "I will not allow you to turn my reunion with Mama Fatima into another corporate public relations event. If you want to help me heal, you will arrange for me to video call her without lawyers or supervisors or people taking notes about our conversation." The standoff that followed lasted 3 days and involved threats, negotiations, and emotional manipulation from both sides that revealed how much their relationship had been built on unspoken power dynamics rather than mutual respect and understanding. David threatened to limit Alexander's computer access and medical independence if he continued to pursue contact with his former caregiver. Alexander responded by threatening to contact news media about his situation and to expose the circumstances of his adoption in ways that could permanently damage his father's business reputation. I found myself caught in the middle of a conflict that was escalating beyond anything I had experienced during my military service, where at least the enemy was clearly identified and the objectives were strategically defined. Here I was watching two people who genuinely loved each other destroy their relationship because neither one was willing to compromise on fundamental issues of identity, control, and cultural belonging. The resolution came from an unexpected source, Mama Fatima herself, who sent a second message through the refugee coordinator that demonstrated wisdom and emotional intelligence that neither David nor Alexander had been able to access during their confrontation. "Khalil Habibi," she wrote, "أنا سعيدة جدا لمعرفة أنك حي وبخير وأنا أفهم أن حياتك الجديدة معقدة. لست أريد أن أسبب لك أي ألم أو قلق. أنا فقط أريد أن تعرف أنني لا أزال أحبك وأن كل الأطفال من دار الأيتام قد كبروا وأشبهوا ناس ناجحون. حبك لعائلتك الجديدة لا يعني أنك نسيت عائلتك القديمة." The message, when translated, carried a profound understanding of the complexity of Alexander's situation. "Khalil, my dear, I am so happy to know that you are alive and well, and I understand that your new life is complicated. I do not want to cause you any pain or worry. I only want you to know that I still love you and that all the children from the orphanage have grown up and become successful people. Your love for your new family does not mean you have forgotten your old family." This message accomplished something that weeks of arguments and negotiations had failed to achieve. It gave both David and Alexander permission to love each other, while acknowledging the complexity of their relationship and the validity of multiple cultural identities existing within the same person. The video call that finally took place between Alexander and Mama Fatima was arranged without fanfare or media attention, conducted in David's home office with only me present to provide technical support and translation assistance if needed. What I witnessed during that 90-minute conversation was a masterclass in unconditional love, cultural healing, and the power of human connection to transcend geographical and linguistic barriers. Mama Fatima spoke to Alexander in Arabic that was gentle and nurturing, asking about his health, his education, and his relationship with his adoptive father with the wisdom of someone who understood that healing required integration rather than rejection of his current life. Alexander responded with a mixture of Arabic and English, switching between languages as his emotions shifted between his cultural identities. Most importantly, Mama Fatima spent significant time talking to David, speaking in careful English that was heavily accented but emotionally powerful. "Mr. David," she said, looking directly into the camera with eyes that reflected decades of caring for displaced children, "you saved my boy's life, and you gave him opportunities that I could never provide. I am grateful to you every day, but now he needs to remember who he was before he can become who he is meant to be." By the end of the call, all three of them were crying, but the tears represented relief and healing rather than grief and loss. For the first time since his accident, Alexander looked genuinely peaceful, his face reflecting the integration of his multiple identities rather than the internal conflict that had been tearing him apart for months. 6 months later, I stood in the gleaming auditorium of the Phoenix Convention Center, watching Alexander wheel himself across the stage with the confidence of someone who had finally found peace with all aspects of his identity. The occasion was Meridian Industries' annual Humanitarian Awards ceremony, an event that David had transformed from a corporate publicity opportunity into a genuine celebration of cross-cultural understanding and refugee assistance programs. Alexander had insisted on delivering the keynote address himself, speaking in both English and Arabic to an audience that included business leaders, humanitarian workers, and refugees from across the American Southwest. His physical therapy had progressed remarkably well, but more importantly, his psychological healing had been profound and visible to everyone who knew him. "My name is Alexander Chen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. "But my first name was Khalil al-Rashid, and I lived in an orphanage in Amman, Jordan until I was 10 years old. Today, I want to tell you about the power of remembering who you are while becoming who you're meant to be." David sat in the front row, his face reflecting pride mixed with the ongoing amazement of a man who had discovered that love could expand rather than diminish when it acknowledged complexity instead of demanding simplicity. Beside him sat Mama Fatima, who had accepted David's invitation to visit Phoenix and had ended up staying for 3 months to help facilitate Alexander's cultural reintegration process. The transformation in their family dynamic had been gradual but revolutionary. David had used his business resources to establish a scholarship program for displaced children, creating educational opportunities that honored their cultural backgrounds instead of erasing them. Alexander had become the program's first spokesperson, sharing his story with other adoptees and refugee families who were struggling to navigate between their original identities and their new circumstances. 6 months ago, I was angry and confused because I felt like I had to choose between loving my adoptive father and honoring my cultural heritage. Alexander continued, his Arabic accent adding richness to his English rather than marking it as foreign or inadequate. But Mama Fatima taught me something that changed everything. She said that love multiplies when you share it, and identity becomes stronger when you acknowledge all its sources. I had continued working with the family as their cultural liaison and medical coordinator, but my role had evolved from crisis intervention to celebration facilitation. My apartment walls were now covered with photographs from Alexander's video calls with childhood friends from the orphanage, images from David's business trips to Jordan, where he was developing renewable energy projects, and pictures from cultural events where Alexander performed traditional Arabic songs while David learned to appreciate music that had once seemed threatening to their relationship. The most profound change had been in David himself, who had discovered that acknowledging the complexity of his family's origin story had actually strengthened his position as both a father and a business leader. His company's refugee assistance programs had generated international recognition and had opened new markets in the Middle East, where his genuine commitment to cultural respect had earned trust that money alone could never have purchased. Today, my father David and I are announcing the opening of the Fatima Al-Rashid Center for Cultural Integration, Alexander said, gesturing toward the architectural rendering that appeared on the screen behind him. This facility will provide educational support, medical care, and cultural preservation resources for refugee families throughout Arizona. But most importantly, it will be a place where children can learn that they don't have to abandon their past to embrace their future. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, but what moved me most was watching Mama Fatima reach over to squeeze David's hand with the natural affection of family members who had learned to appreciate each other's contributions to their shared loved one's well-being. Their friendship had developed slowly, built on mutual respect for each other's sacrifices and recognition that Alexander's happiness required both of their continued involvement in his life. As the ceremony concluded and guests moved toward the reception area, I found myself reflecting on how completely my understanding of family, identity, and healing had been transformed by this experience. My military training had taught me to solve problems through decisive action and clear objectives, but working with Alexander and David had shown me that the most important victories often required patience, compromise, and the willingness to accept solutions that were more complex than the problems they addressed. Alexander wheeled over to where I was standing, his face glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully completed a mission that everyone had once considered impossible. "Joseph," he said, switching to Arabic with the ease that had become natural to him. "Shukran laka li kul shay. Bisabab musa'adatik. أصبحت قادر على أن أكون خليل وألكسندر في نفس الوقت." Thank you for everything. Because of your help, I became able to be both Khalil and Alexander at the same time. David approached us with Mama Fatima beside him, both of them beaming with pride that had been earned through months of difficult conversations, cultural learning, and the gradual construction of a family structure that honored everyone's needs instead of protecting only one person's comfort. "Joseph," David said, extending his hand with the genuine gratitude of someone whose entire worldview had been challenged and ultimately expanded, "I owe you an apology and a debt that I can never fully repay. You didn't just help my son recover from his accident. You helped all of us recover from years of living with fundamental dishonesty about who we really are." As I watched the three of them walk together toward the reception, Alexander's wheelchair flanked by the two adults who had shaped his life in different but equally important ways, I realized that this story had no traditional ending, because real healing is an ongoing process rather than a destination. They would continue to navigate the complexities of their multicultural family, continue to learn from each other's perspectives, and continue to demonstrate that love becomes stronger when it embraces rather than erases differences. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.